Chapter 27. Marge called Mr. Greenleaf at 8:30 the next morning to ask how soon they could come over to his hotel, she had told Tom. But Mr. Greenleaf must have noticed that she was upset. Tom heard her starting to tell him the story of the rings. Marge used the same words that Tom had used to her about the rings. Evidently, Marge had believed him, but Tom could not tell what Mr. Greenleaf's reaction was. He was afraid this piece of news might be just the one that would bring the whole picture into focus, and that when they saw Mr. Greenleaf this morning, he might be in the company of a policeman ready to arrest Tom Ripley. This possibility rather offset the advantage of his not being on the scene when Mr. Greenleaf heard about the rings. "What did he say?" Tom asked when Marge had hung up. Marge sat down tiredly on a chair across the room. "He seemed to feel the way I do. He said it himself. It looks as if Dickie meant to kill himself." But Mr. Greenleaf would have a little time to think about it before they got there, Tom thought. "What time are we due?" Tom asked. "I told him about 9:30 or before, as soon as we had some coffee. The coffee's on now." Marge got up and went into the kitchen. She was already dressed. She had on the traveling suit that she had worn when she arrived. Tom sat up indecisively on the edge of the sofa and loosened his tie. He had slept in his clothes on the sofa, and Marge had awakened him when she had come down a few minutes ago. How he had possibly slept all night in the chilly room he didn't know. It embarrassed him. Marge had been amazed to find him there. There was a crick in his neck, his back, and his right shoulder. He felt wretched. He stood up suddenly. "I'm going upstairs to wash," he called to Marge. He glanced into his room upstairs and saw that Marge had packed her suitcase. It was lying in the middle of the floor, closed. Tom hoped that she and Mr. Greenleaf were still leaving on one of the morning trains. Probably they would, because Mr. Greenleaf was supposed to meet the American detective in Rome today. Tom undressed in the room next to Marge, then went into the bathroom and turned on the shower. After a look at himself in the mirror, he decided to shave first, and he went back to the room to get his electric razor, which he had removed from the bathroom for no particular reason, when Marge arrived. On the way back, he heard the telephone ring, and Marge answered it. Tom leaned over the stairwell, listening. "Oh, that's fine," she said. "Oh, that doesn't matter if we don't. Yes, I'll tell him. All right, we'll hurry. Tom's just washing up. Oh, less than an hour. Bye-bye." He heard her walk toward the stairs, and he stepped back because he was naked. "Tom," she yelled up, "the detective from America just got here. He just called Mr. Greenleaf, and he's coming from the airport." "Fine," Tom called back and angrily went into the bedroom. He turned the shower off and plugged his razor into the wall outlet. Suppose he'd been under the shower. Marge would have yelled up anyway, simply assuming that he would be able to hear her. He would be glad when she was gone, and he hoped she left this morning, unless she and Mr. Greenleaf decided to stay to see what the detective was going to do with him. Tom knew that the detective had come to Venice especially to see him. Otherwise, he would have waited to see Mr. Greenleaf in Rome. Tom wondered if Marge realized that too. Probably she didn't. That took a minimum of deduction. Tom put on a quiet suit and tie and went down to have coffee with Marge. He had taken his shower as hot as he could bear it, and he felt much better. Marge said nothing during the coffee except that the rings should make a great difference both to Mr. Greenleaf and to the detective. She meant that it should look to the detective too, as if Dickie had killed himself. Tom hoped she was right. Everything depended on what kind of man the detective would be. Everything depended on the first impression he made on the detective. It was another gray, clammy day, not quite raining at 9 o'clock, but it had rained. And it would rain again, probably toward noon. Tom and Marge caught the gondola from the church steps to San Marco and walked from there to the Gritti. They telephoned up to Mr. Greenleaf's room. Mr. Greenleaf said that Mr. Macaron was there and asked them to come up. Mr. Greenleaf opened his door for them. "Good morning," he said. He pressed Marge's arm into a fatherly way. "Tom?" Tom came in behind Marge. The detective was standing by the window, a short, chunky man of about 35. His face looked friendly and alert. Moderately bright, but only moderately, was Tom's first impression. "This is Alvin McCarran," Mr. Greenleaf said. "Miss Sherwood and Mr. Ripley." They all said, "How do you do?" Tom noticed a brand new briefcase on the bed with some papers and photographs lying around it. McCarran was looking him over. "I understand you're a friend of Richard's," he asked. "We both are," Tom said. They were interrupted for a minute while Mr. Greenleaf saw that they were all seated. It was a good-sized, heavily furnished room with windows on the canal. Tom sat down in an armless chair upholstered in red. McCarran had installed himself on the bed and was looking through his sheafs of papers. There were a few photostated papers, Tom saw, that looked like pictures of Dickie's checks. There were also several loose photographs of Dickie. "Do you have the rings?" McCarran asked, looking from Tom to Marge. "Yes," Marge said sullenly, getting up. She took the rings from her handbag and gave them to McCarran. McCarran held them out in his palm to Mr. Greenleaf. "These are his rings?" he asked, and Mr. Greenleaf nodded after only a glance at them, while Marge's face took on a slightly affronted expression, as if she were about to say, "I know his rings just as well as Mr. Greenleaf had probably better." McCarran turned to Tom. "When did he give them to you?" he asked. "In Rome? As nearly as I can remember, around February 3rd, just a few days after the murder of Freddie Miles," Tom asked. The detective was studying him with his inquisitive, mild brown eye. His lifted eyebrows put a couple of wrinkles in the thick-looked skin of his forehead. He had wavy brown hair cut very short on the side, with a high curl above his forehead, in a rather cute college boy style. One couldn't tell a thing from that face, Tom thought. It was trained. What did he say when he gave them to you? "He said that if anything happened to him, he wanted me to have them. I asked him what he thought was going to happen to him. He said he didn't know, but something might." Tom paused deliberately. He didn't seem more depressed at the particular moment than a lot of other times. "I talked to him, so it didn't cross my mind that he was going to kill himself. I knew he intended to go away, that was all." "Where?" asked the detective. "To Palermo," he said. Tom looked at Marge. "He must have given them to me the day you spoke to me in Rome at the Inghilterra. That day or the day before. Do you remember the date?" "February 2nd, Marge said in a subdued voice. McCarran was making note. "What else?" he asked Tom. "What time of day was it? Had he been drinking?" "No, he drinks very little. I think it was very early afternoon. He said it would be just as well if I didn't mention the rings to anybody, and of course I agreed. I put the rings away and completely forgot about them, as I told Miss Sherwood. I suppose because I'd so impressed on myself that he didn't want me to say anything about them." Tom spoke straightforwardly, stammering a little, inadvertently, just as anyone might stammer under circumstances, Tom thought. "What did you do with the rings?" "I put them in an old box that I have, just a little box I keep odd buttons in." McCarran regarded him for a moment in silence, and Tom took the moment to brace himself. Out of that placid yet alert Irish face could come anything, a challenging question, a flat statement that he was lying. Tom clung harder in his mind to his own facts, determined to defend them until death. In the silence, Tom could almost hear Marge's breathing, and a cough from Mr. Greenleaf made him start. Mr. Greenleaf looked remarkably calm, almost bored. Tom wondered if he had fixed up some scheme with McCarran against him based on the ring story. "Is he the kind of man to lend you the rings for luck for a short time? He had ever done anything like that before?" McCarran asked. "No," Marge said before Tom could answer. Tom began to breathe more easily. He could see that McCarran didn't know yet what he should make out of it. McCarran was waiting for him to answer. "He had let me certain things before," Tom said. "He told me to help myself to his ties and jackets now and then, but that's quite a different matter from the rings, of course." He had felt a compulsion to say that because Marge undoubtedly knew about the time Dickie had found him in his clothes. "I can't imagine Dickie without his rings," Marge said to McCarran. "He took the green one off when he was swimming, but he always put it right back on again." They were just like part of his dressing. That's why I think he was either intending to kill himself or he meant to change his identity. But Karen nodded. Had he any enemies that you know of? Absolutely none, Tom said. I thought of that. Any reason you can think of why he might have wanted to disguise himself or assume another identity? Tom said, carefully twisting his aching neck. Possibly, but it's next to impossible in Europe. He'd have to have a different passport. Any country he'd have entered, he would have to have a passport. He'd have to have a passport even to get into a hotel. You told me he might not have had to have a passport, Mr. Greenleaf said. Yes, I said that about small hotels in Italy. It's a remote possibility, of course, but after all this publicity about his disappearance, I don't see how he could still be keeping it up, Tom said. Somebody would surely have betrayed him by this time. Well, he left with his passport, obviously, McLaurin said, because he got into Sicily with it and registered at a big hotel. Yes, Tom said. McLaurin made notes for a moment, then looked up at Tom. Well, how do you see it, Mr. Ripley? McCarran wasn't nearly finished, Tom thought. McCarran was going to see him alone later. I'm afraid I agree with Miss Sherwood that it looks as if he killed himself, and it looks as if he intended to all along. I've said that before to Mr. Greenleaf. McCarran looked at Mr. Greenleaf, but Mr. Greenleaf said nothing, only looked expectantly at McCarran. Tom had the feeling that McCarran was now inclined to think that Dickie was dead too, and that it was a waste of time and money for him to have come over. I just want to check these facts again, McCarran said, still plodding on, going back to his papers. The last time Richard was seen by anyone was February 15th, when he got off the boat in Naples coming in from Palermo. That's correct, Mr. Greenleaf said. A steward remembers seeing him. But no sign of him in any hotel after that, and no communications from him since. McCarran looked from Mr. Greenleaf to Tom. No, Tom said. McCarran looked at Marge. No, Marge said. And what was the last time you saw him, Miss Sherwood? On November 23rd, when he left from San Remo, Marge said promptly. You were there in Mongebello? McCarran asked, pronouncing the town's name with a hard G, as if it had no knowledge of England or Italian. Yes, Marge said. I just missed seeing him in Rome in February, but the last time I saw him was in Mongebello. Good old Marge. Tom felt almost affectionate toward her underneath everything. He had begun to feel affectionate this morning, even though she had irritated him. He was trying to avoid everyone in Rome, Tom put it. That's why, when he first gave me the rings, I thought he was on some tack of getting away for everyone he had known, living in another city and just vanishing for a while. Why do you think that? Tom elaborated, mentioning the murder of his friend Freddie Miles and its effect on Dickie. Do you think Richard knew who killed Freddie Miles? No, I certainly don't. McCarran waited for Marge's opinion. No, Marge said, shaking her head. Think a minute, McCarran said to Tom. Do you think that might have explained his behavior? Do you think he's avoiding answering the police by hiding out now? Tom thought for a minute. He didn't give me a single clue in that direction. Do you think Dickie was afraid of something? I can't imagine of what, Tom said. McCarran asked Tom how close a friend Dickie had been to Freddie Miles, who else he knew who was a friend of both Dickie and Freddie, if any knew of any debts between them, any girlfriends. Only Marge that I know of, Tom replied, and Marge protested that she wasn't a girlfriend of Freddie's, so there couldn't possibly have been any rivalry over her, and could Tom say that he was Dickie's best friend in Europe? I wouldn't say that, Tom answered. I think Marge Sherwood is. I hardly know any of Dickie's friends in Europe. McCarran studied Tom's face again. What's your opinion about these forgeries? Are they forgeries? I didn't think anybody was sure. I don't think they are, Marge said. Opinions seem to be divided, McCarran said. The experts don't think the letter he wrote to the bank in Naples is a forgery, which can only mean that if there is a forgery somewhere, he's covering up for someone, assuming there is a forgery. Do you have any idea who might be trying to cover up for? Tom hesitated a moment, and Marge said, knowing him, I can't imagine him covering up for anyone. Why should he? McCarran was staring at Tom, but whether he was debating his honesty or mulling over all they had said to him, Tom couldn't tell. McCarran looked like a typical American automobile salesman, or any other kind of salesman, Tom thought. Cheerful, presentable, average in intellect, able to talk baseball with a man or pay a stupid compliment to a woman. Tom didn't think too much of him, but on the other hand, it was not wise to underestimate one's opponent. McCarran's small, soft mouth opened as Tom watched him, as he said, "Would you mind coming downstairs with me for a few minutes, Mr. Ripley, if you still got a few minutes?" "Oh, certainly," Tom said, standing up. "We won't be long," McCarran said to Mr. Greenleaf and Marge. Tom looked back from the door because Mr. Greenleaf had gotten up and was starting to say something, though Tom didn't listen. Tom was suddenly aware that it was raining. That thin gray sheet of rain were slapping against the window panes. It was like the last glimpse, blurred and hasty. Marge's figure looked small and huddled across the big room, Mr. Greenleaf doddering forward like an old man protesting. But the comfortable room was that thing, and the view across the canal is where his house stood, invisible now because of the rain, which he might never see again. Mr. Greenleaf was asking, are you coming back in a few minutes?" "Oh, yes," McCarran answered with the impersonal firmness of an executioner. They walked toward the elevator. Was this the way they did it? Tom wondered. A quiet word in the lobby. He would be handed over to the Italian police, and then McCarran would return to the room just as he had promised. McCarran had brought a couple of the papers from his briefcase with him. Tom stared at the ornamental vertical molding beside the floor number panel in the elevator, an egg-shaped design framed by 4 raised dots, egg-shaped dots all the way down. Think of some sensible, ordinary remark to make about Mr. Greenleaf, for instance. Tom said to himself. He ground his teeth. If he only would start sweating now. He hadn't started yet, but maybe it would break out all over his face when they reached the lobby. McCarran was hardly as tall as his shoulder. Tom turned to him just as the elevator stopped and said grimly, baring his teeth in a smile, "Is this your first trip to Venice?" "Yes," said McCarran. He was crossing the lobby. "Shall we go in here?" He indicated the coffee bar. His tone was polite. "All right," Tom said agreeably. The bar was not crowded, but there was not a single table that would be out of earshot of some other table. Would McCarran accuse him in a place like this, quietly laying down fact after fact on the table? He took the chair that McCarran pulled out for him. McCarran sat with his back to the wall. A waiter came up. "Signori!" "Coffee," McCarran said. "Cappuccino," Tom said. "Would you like cappuccino or an espresso?" "Which is the one with milk?" "Cappuccino." "Yes, I'll have that." Tom gave the order. McCarran looked at him. His small mouth smiled on the other side. Tom imagined 3 or 4 different beginnings. "You killed Richard, didn't you? The ring are just too much, aren't they?" Or, "Tell me about the San Remo boat, Mr. Ripley, in detail." Or simply, leading up quietly, "Where were you on February 15th, when Richard landed in Naples?" "All right, but where were you living then?" "Were you living in January, for instance? Can you prove it?" McCarran was saying nothing at all, only looking down at the plump hands now, and smiled faintly, as if it had been so absurdly simple for him to unravel. Tom thought that he could hardly force himself to put it into words. At a table next to them, 4 Italian men were babbling away like a madhouse, screeching with wild laughter. Tom wanted to edge away from them. He sat motionless. Tom braced himself until his body felt like iron, until sheer tension created defiance. He heard himself ask, in an incredible calm voice, "Did you have time to speak to Tenente Roverini when you came through Rome?" At the same time he asked it, he realized that he had even an objective in the question to find out if McCarran had heard about the San Remo boat. "No, I didn't," McCarran said. "There was a message for me that Mr. Greenleaf would be in Rome today, but I landed in Rome so early I thought I'd fly over and catch him and also talk to you." McCarran looked down at his papers. "What kind of man is Richard? How would you describe him far as his personality goes?" Was McCarran going to lead up to this like this? Pick out more little clues from words he chose to describe him? Or did he only want the objective opinion that he couldn't get from Dickie's parents? He wanted to be a painter, Tom began, but he knew he'd never be a very good painter. He tried to act as if he didn't care, as if it were perfectly happy and leading exactly the kind of life he wanted to lead over here in Europe. Tom moistened his lips. "But I think the life was beginning to get him down. His father's disapproved, as you probably know, and Dickie had gotten himself into an awkward spot with Marge." "How do you mean?" "Marge was in love with him, and he wasn't with her. and at the same time he was seeing her so much in Montebello, she kept on hoping. Tom began to feel on safe ground, but he pretended to have difficulty in expressing himself. He never actually discussed it with me. He always spoke very high of Marge. He was very fond of her, but it was very obvious to everyone, Marge too, that he never would marry her. But Marge never quite gave up. I think that's the main reason Dickie left Montebello. McCarran listened patiently and sympathetically, Tom thought. What do you mean, never gave up? What did she do? Tom waited until the waiter had set down the 2 frothy cups of cappuccino and stuck the tab between them under the sugar bowl. She kept writing to him, wanting to see him, and at the same time being very tactful, I'm sure about now, intruding on him when he wanted to be by himself. He told me all this in Rome when I saw him. He said after the Miles murder that he certainly wasn't in the mood to see Marge, and he was afraid that she'd come up to Rome from Montebello when she heard of all the trouble he was in. Why do you think he was nervous about the Miles murder? McCarran took a sip of the coffee, winced for the heat of the bitterness, and stirred it with a spoon. Tom explained. They'd been quite good friends, and Freddie had been killed just a few minutes after leaving his house. Do you think Richard might have killed Freddie? McGarren asked quietly. No, I don't. Why? Because there was no reason for him to kill him, at least no reason that I happen to know of. People usually say because so-and-so wasn't the type to kill anybody, McCarran said. Do you think Richard was the type who could have killed anyone? Tom hesitated, seeking earnestly for the truth. I never thought of it. I don't know what kind of people are apt to kill somebody. I've seen him angry. When? Tom described the 2 days in Rome, when Dickie, he said, had been angry and frustrated because the police questioned and had actually moved out of his apartment to avoid phone calls from friends and strangers. Tom tied this in with growing frustration in Dickie because he had not been progressing as he had wanted to in his painting. He depicted Dickie as a stubborn, proud young man, in awe of his father and therefore determined to defy his father's wishes, a rather erratic fellow who was generous to strangers as well as to his friends, but who was subject to change of mood, from sociability to sullen withdrawal. He summed it up by saying that Dickie was a very ordinary young man who liked to think he was extraordinary. If he killed himself, Tom concluded, I think it was because he realized certain failures in himself, inadequacies. It's much easier for me to imagine him a suicide than a murderer. But I'm not sure that he didn't kill Freddie Miles, are you? McCarran was perfectly sincere. Tom was sure of that. McCarran was even expecting him to defend Dickie now because they had been friends. Tom felt some of his terror leaving him, but only some of it, like something melting very slowly inside him. I'm not sure, Tom said, but I just don't believe that he did. I'm not sure either, but it would explain a lot, wouldn't it? Yes, Tom said, everything. Well, this is only the first day of work, McCarran said with an optimistic smile. I haven't even looked over the report in Rome. I'll probably want to talk to you after I've been to Rome. Tom stared at him. It seemed to be over. Do you speak Italian? Not very well, but I can read it. I do better in French, but I'll get along, McCarran said, as if it were not a matter of much importance. It was very important, Tom thought. He couldn't imagine McCarran extracting everything that Roverini knew about the Greenleaf case solely through an interpreter. Neither would McCarran be able to get around and chat with people like Dickie Greenleaf's landlady in Rome. It was most important. I talked with Roverini here in Venice a few weeks ago, Tom said. Give him my regards. I'll do that, McCarran finished his coffee. Knowing Dickie, what place do you think he would be likely to go if he wanted to hide out? Tom squirmed back a little on the chair. This was getting down to the bottom of the barrel, he thought. Well, I thought he liked Italy best. I wouldn't bet on France. He also likes Greece. He talked about going to Majorca at some time. All the Spain is a possibility, I suppose. I see, McGarren said, sighing. Are you going back to Rome today? McGarren raised his eyebrows. I imagine so, if I can catch a few hours' sleep here. I haven't been to bed in 2 days. He held up very well, Tom thought. I think Mr. Greenleaf was wondering about the trains. There are 2 this morning and probably some more this afternoon. He was planning to leave today. We can leave today. McCarran reached for the check. Thanks very much for your help, Mr. Ripley. I have your address and phone number in case I have to see you again. They stood up. Mind if I go with you and say goodbyes to Marge and Mr. Greenleaf? McCarran didn't mind. They rode up the elevator again. Tom had to check himself for whistling. Papa non vuole was going around in his head. Tom looked close at Marge as they went in, looking for signs of enmity. Marge only looked a little tragic, he thought, as if she had recently been made a widow. "I'd like to ask you a few questions alone, too, Miss Sherwood," McCarran said. "If you don't mind," he said to Mr. Greenleaf. "Certainly not. I was just going down to the lobby to buy some newspapers," Mr. Greenleaf said. McCarran was carrying on. Tom said goodbye to Marge and to Mr. Greenleaf in case they were going to Rome today, and he did not see them again. He said to McCarran, "I'd be very glad to come to Rome at any time if I can be of any help. I expect to be here until the end of May anyway." "We'll have something before then," McCarran said with his confident Irish smile. Tom went down to the lobby with Mr. Greenleaf. "He asked me the same question all over again," Tom told Mr. Greenleaf, "and also my opinion of Richard's character." "Well, what is your opinion?" Mr. Greenleaf asked in a hopeless tone. Whether he was a suicide or had run away to hide himself would be conduct equally reprehensible in Mr. Greenleaf's eye. Tom knew. "I told him what I think is the truth," Tom said, "that he's capable of running away and also capable of committing suicide." Mr. Greenleaf made no comment, only patted Tom's arm. "Goodbye, Tom." "Goodbye," Tom said. "Let me hear from you." Everything was all right between him and Mr. Greenleaf, Tom thought, and everything would be all right with Marge, too. She had swallowed the suicide exclamation, and that was the direction her mind would run into from now on, he knew. Tom spent the afternoon at home expecting a telephone call, one telephone call at least from McCarran, even if it was not about anything important, but not came. There was only a call from Titty, the resident countess, inviting him to a cocktail that afternoon. Tom accepted. Why should he expect any trouble from Marge, he thought. She never had given him any. The suicide was an easy fix, and she would arrange everything in her dull imagination to fit it.